Hey everybody, welcome back to class. This is our Module 2 mini lecture video, Behavior and Consequences. I hope that you have been able to navigate the classroom pretty well during Module number 1 and that you're doing well and getting settled in. And I want to just highlight a couple of things for you. And this little, these is actually going to be two of these little mini lecture videos at the first start part of this module to highlight for you some things that I've included in the lecture notes and in the PowerPoint presentation. So make sure you're looking at that information in addition to all the handouts that I've put up for you as well too. Just a real quick word of announcement. Don't forget that you have the TV show / textbook review assignment that I've posted for you. And that needs to be worked on. Look in the syllabus and look on the handout for the due date for that assignment. But so you should be kind of working alongside that working on that assignment as you kind of go along. And we've already talked a little bit about that assignment before, but that's just a word of reminder to you. So we are talking in this class in Module 2 about behavior and consequences. A little review from Module number 1. This class, as we've already discussed, is a class that really focuses on an old helping approach or counseling theory called behavior theory. Behavior theory has been around for a long, long time. It's one of the many approaches that we use in helping today in all kinds of different ways. And it's a helping approach. That's what counseling theories are. And it is the focus of this particular class. Later this semester, we're going to look at cognitive behavior theory, which is related to behavior theory in some ways. And so, but the focus really is for this class mainly is behavior theory. And one of the great ways to understand all these different theories is to understand the core ideas or the core concepts that every theory proposes about human nature, human behavior, human problems, the change process, all of that kind of stuff. Every theory has at its core some basic foundational beliefs that you got to kind of grab onto if you're going to understand what the theory really is all about. So module number 1, we focused on those 5 core theories of behavior theory. Behavior has 3 forms. It's what we say, what we do, what we think. Behavior is always happening. Behavior theory is more interested, thirdly, in not the labels that we use to refer to behavior, but the actual behavior itself. We often use labels, but this theory is less interested in the labels and it's more interested in actual behavior. So there's a de-emphasis on labels. There's also a de-emphasis, fourthly, on emotions and feelings. And so this is a theory that's just more interested in the actual physical, verbal, and cognitive behavior that we engage in. It's less interested in the emotional feelings part of us. Again, does that mean that this theory ignores that part of us? No. Does this theory propose or teach that that part of us is not important? Not at all. It's just this is just a counseling and helping approach that is more interested in the behavioral part of us than the emotional part of us. And then fifthly, we talked about the A, antecedent, the B, behavior, and the C, consequences. A, B, C, antecedent, behavior, and consequences. And that just teaches us this idea. A lot of times when you and I act or say something or we think something, that's behavior or B. It's often in response to something happening around us in our environment or within us. That's A, antecedent. Antecedent is just a trigger. Antecedent is just something that kind of goes on and precedes a behavior that oftentimes influences what we do. So antecedents oftentimes precede our behavior, and understanding the antecedent of a behavior, as we talked about before, can sometimes help us to understand the behavior. Why did it occur? What does it mean? What's it about, right? So antecedents, then behavior, and then BC, behavior results in consequences. Antecedent, behavior, and consequences. So in this module, module number 2, we camp out around the BC idea, the idea of behavior and consequences. That idea that behavior results in consequences, which we talked a little bit about last week, we talked about ABC, is really an old idea in psychology and counseling. In fact, in the early days of psychology, especially the field of psychology, the early days of psychology really were built around researchers and psychologists studying human behavior and trying to understand how the consequences of our behavior influence who we are and what we do, and that whole idea of behavior and consequences. And so for this first little key video, and again, I'm just kind of summarizing what I've provided for you in your lecture notes. So make sure you go get your lecture notes and review those as well too. There's 2 key ideas I want to highlight for you in this first little mini video. Number 1 is this: behavior results in consequences. The second idea we're going to talk about in just a second is this. And consequences influence behavior. Behavior results in consequences. That's the first idea we want to talk about this week. And the second idea is in this video, and consequences influence behavior. Many, many years ago, when I was a graduate student up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, I was getting my master's degree in counseling. And I was working in a residential treatment center with at-risk kids. So these were kids, some of them were involved with the Child Protective Services, the CPS system. Others were in juvenile justice. Some had psychiatric problems. Some had mental health problems. Some had substance abuse problems. Some were runaways. And they were living at this facility for 30 days or 60 days or 45 days. I was a direct care professional. I was a mental health tech or technician, it was my job title. And so I'd work 3 or 4 days a week in the afternoon. I go to school in the morning and work in the afternoon. And really, my job was just to supervise and manage the kids. I just would kind of hang around them all the time, make sure they wouldn't get in trouble. I'd hang out with them and play basketball or shoot pool or go to the cafeteria and eat dinner with them and that kind of thing. And so when I was first hired on, they had me shadow a man named Walt. Walt had the same job I had, but he had been doing it for many, 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 many years. Walt was a Vietnam veteran, and he was an older guy, kind of rough around the edges, but he had a heart and a passion for serving at-risk kids, and the kids loved him. He had a unique way of connecting with them, and he never talked down to them. He always got on their level, and he just never let their behavior, kind of distract him. And he was just a great role model for me. And when I was hired, they had me shadow Walt as like my trainer. He kind of was my trainer. And probably the second day I was there, I was playing basketball with some kids, and some kids got into an argument, and then they kind of started doing some stuff they shouldn't have been doing, and they kind of got in trouble. And Walt kind of showed up. I was out there by myself with them, and they were kind of acting up a little bit. He kind of showed up and helped me kind of get them settled down a little bit. And at the very, very end, before we went in the building, he circled. There's about 8 or 9 kids. He circled them up, and he said, "Guys, before we go in, let me ask you this question: What's brick?" And I was standing over the side, and I didn't know what that meant. He said, "Y'all know what that is? What's brick?" And the kids at first didn't say anything. And then finally, some kid spoke up and he said, "Behavior results in consequences." He's like, "Yep, brick, BRIC." And that was Walt's kind of slogan. He would tell kids over and over again, behavior results in consequences. In other words, think about what you're doing, because every behavior you engage in has a consequence or consequences that come with it. So be careful the choices that was kind of a lesson that he would always try to teach. And he had a little conversation with those kids on that basketball court that day about this idea of, hey, listen, you know what? The consequences that you experience as a result of your behavior, hey, that's on you. So be careful about the consequences. Be careful about the behavior you engage in. And he said, I remember him saying, that's true for me too. I have to be careful about the behavior I engage in, because again, all of us experience consequences as a result of our behavior. Brick. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, this idea that behavior results in consequences. Now, we all know what consequences are. A consequence is anything that we experience as the result of our behavior. And the consequences can look 100 different ways. And so consequences are things that we experience in our lives as a direct result of what we do. Anything that we experience as a result of our behavior is a consequence. And we could go on, we could talk for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours about the different kinds of consequences that we experience and can experience when we act. We often experience, by the way, more than one consequence. We oftentimes talk in classes like we engage in one behavior and we experience one consequence. That's not really true. We're usually engaged in multiple behaviors, experiencing multiple consequences. So consequences can look a lot of different ways. Just real quickly, though, there are 4 general categories that consequences kind of fall into, and I give you these in your lecture notes. And there's often an overlap between these 4 different areas of consequences. But just for sake of understanding, number 1, we can and we do experience what's called material consequences. A material consequence is anything you and I can hold in our hand. If you do a job and someone pays you money. When you were a kid and you did chores, maybe your parents gave you money. When I was a kid growing up in school, you would get gold stars. A teacher would give you a gold star and you put it on like a star chart. Someone gives you a gift as a result of something you've done for them. You have an actual material consequence. Some consequences we experience as a result of our behavior are material. We can put our hands on them. Others, though, a lot of times are not material. For example, we also experience lots of social consequences. Social consequences are really the behavior of other people, the reactions that we get because of our behavior from other people, the words that we exchange back and forth, the acceptance, the rejection, the someone being impressed with us or whatever it may be, someone noticing us. Lots of behavior, lots of consequences of our behavior are really social in nature. So it's not just material what we can hold on to, black and white. It's a lot of consequences are also social. And then there are some that are internal. So for example, there are biochemical consequences. So if you and I today were to go and get, lunch somewhere, and as we eat our lunch, as we're putting that food into our body and our body is digesting that food, there are all the biochemical consequences. There's the emotions that we feel internally. There is our brain, our heart rate, our blood being influenced, right? So the biochemical consequences. You go and you smoke a cigarette, and so all that nicotine gets into your system. It sort of speeds the heart rate up or slows it down, helps you feel calm or soothed, or what affects your brain metabolism, and your body. So biochemical, physiological consequences. And then also internal too are emotional and psychological consequences. Some of you, when you come to school, by coming to school, one of the consequences I hope your experience is a sense of fulfillment. You feel like you're accomplishing something, you're learning something that feels good, right? Maybe you feel a sense of pride. You do something, you feel a sense of accomplishment, like you've done something. Sometimes we feel a sense of guilt or shame or whatever it may be. And so those are also internal. A lot of the consequences we experience as a result of our behavior are really emotional and psychological in nature. They're not just material, right? But they can be. And so these four categories: social, material, biochemical, emotional / psychological. Those are just four just good examples, four good kind of just general kind of categories, of which there's often an overlap. We often experience multiple different kinds of consequences, right? We may experience a social consequence and an emotional consequence at the same time. So consequences can and do look a lot of different ways. Bottom line is, this idea from behavior theory is that our behavior always results in some kind of consequence. We cannot not act. And when we act, we cannot not experience some kind of consequence, because we live in a world, we don't live in a vacuum. We live in a world where our behavior has an influence on the world around us and vice versa, right? So this idea that behavior results in consequences, brick. That's the first idea. Second idea is this. It doesn't stop there. Not only does my behavior and your behavior result in certain kinds of consequences, how I perceive those consequences often influences what I do next. So not only does behavior result in consequences, but consequences then influence future behavior. That's the second idea. So this idea that oftentimes how we perceive the consequence that we experience, is it favorable or is it unfavorable? That often plays a role in what we do next behaviorally. Now, generally, we have a long conversation. Human behavior can be kind of complicated, right? In some ways. But generally speaking, consequences tend to have two effects on behavior. They either strengthen that behavior, making it more likely to occur in the future, or they tend to weaken the behavior, making it less likely to occur in the future. So you're familiar with the terms reinforcement and punishment. Let's talk about reinforcement and punishment for just a little bit, okay? So reinforcement and punishment, there's really a lot we could say about those concepts. You really can't take a class like this, a behavior mod class, and not talk about reinforcement and punishment. In many ways, reinforcement and punishment as concepts are pretty simple. But also, too, they're a little complex. They can be a little bit complex. And I remember being a psychology student and having classes where my professors would talk about reinforcement versus punishment. And there were times when I would kind of get confused. For this class, we're going to keep it really, really simple, okay? So reinforcement is a term we use anytime that the result of the consequence on a behavior is that it tends to strengthen that behavior, making it more likely to occur in the future. That's reinforcement. Reinforcement is at play Anytime the consequence that follows a behavior has the result that it strengthens that behavior, making it more likely to occur in the future. Most often, not always, but most often, reinforcement is at play when I view the consequences of my behavior as favorable. Notice I didn't use the word positive. Favorable just means something that I want, something that I need, something that I like generally. So, generally, we tend to engage in behaviors over and over and over again that bring us consequences that we like, that are favorable to us generally. And so anytime you see a behavior that occurs over and over and over again, reinforcement is at play. Any behavior that is consistent and constant, behavior theory would say, at some level there's a consequence that is reinforcing that behavior. So reinforcement is a term we use anytime the result of a consequence on a behavior is that it strengthens that behavior, making it more likely to occur in the future. Punishment is the opposite because not every single consequence that we experience strengthens our behavior. There are some consequences that we experience that have a natural result of weakening our behavior, making that behavior less likely to occur in the future. That's called punishment. So punishment is a term that in our culture, in our society, often has a very negative connotation. We talk about corporal punishment or spanking. We talk about capital punishment. In this context, the term punishment is a neutral term. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. The term punishment is a term we use anytime we see that the consequence of a behavior naturally tends to weaken that behavior, making it less likely to occur in the future. Anytime we see that happening, that's called punishment. So, again, there's a lot more we probably could get into and talk about when it comes to punishment and reinforcement. The author of our textbook gives a little bit more detail. You're probably familiar with the concepts of the terms positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. We're not really going to get into that too much in this class because we could, but we're just not going to for the sake of time. What I want you to do is I want you to grab onto this idea, the general idea that consequences influence behavior. Not only does behavior result in consequences, the consequences we experience influence what we do next. Sometimes the consequences that we experience naturally strengthen our behavior, making it more likely to occur in the future. That's called reinforcement. Other times, the consequences that we experience weaken our behavior, making it go away or less likely to occur in the future. And when that happens, that's called punishment. I always think about when I first started teaching here many, many years ago. I've been teaching now here at the college full time for 18 years. And prior to that, I taught for 3 years as an adjunct at night, one night a week. And when I came to teach as an adjunct instructor, I had never, ever taught a college level class before, ever. I had led a lot of groups, and I used a lot of my group facilitation kind of skills to kind of lead my classes. And but I'd never taught before, and I really wasn't sure. I kind of had to figure out how to teach. Right. One of the things I knew I did not want my students to be bored. I did not want them to be disinterested. So I thought about ways to make my classes and the way I teach interesting and engaging. The very, very first night of the very, very first class that I taught, I spent the first hour reading line by line the syllabus. I don't do that anymore, but I used to. My first semester, it was a small class on a Thursday night, had about 12 or 13 students, and we spent the first hour just going over the syllabus, and it was dead. Nobody asked a question, nobody raised their hand. I could tell kind of through their behavior that they were bored and kind of tired. And so I want you to think about that from a behavioral perspective. So my behavior is I'm reading the syllabus out loud. What consequence am I experiencing? The feedback I'm getting from students is they're disinterested. Well, I didn't want that. So that behavior of reading the syllabus, I stopped doing that. It's called punishment. That doesn't seem like punishment, but that's what it was. So so I got about three-quarters of the way through the syllabus and I was like, in my head, I'm thinking, I'm not doing this. So I just said to this class, why don't we do something else? And they were like, yeah. So their reaction of yeah was like the consequence of my behavior. So I put down the syllabus and I began to talk a little bit about what the class was about. And I began to talk a little bit about myself. And the more I began to do that, I began to crack some stupid jokes about myself that people began to laugh. People began to raise their hand. People began to share. And that was the consequence of that behavior, the behavior of putting the syllabus down and being more personable and sharing from my own experiences and talking and giving real life examples about what the class was about. The consequence I experienced was the people I could tell they were more engaged. So guess what I did? I kept doing that. I learned from that experience. People don't want to hear about the syllabus. They want to hear about what the class is about. So the more I talked and cracked jokes and kind of asked them for examples, the more I could just tell from their reaction, the more engaged they were. Well, that consequence strengthened my behavior, meaning that I just kept doing what I was doing because that was what I want. I didn't want them to be bored, right? So think back about how we oftentimes reinforce and punish one another through social consequences, like we just talked about, right? So think about that example of how I learned that very, very first night that, hey, if you just read to students, that's boring to them. And to me, that is an unfavorable consequence. So I try to stay away from stuff that's punishment. I try to stay away from stuff that's boring. I'm more drawn to activities and approaches that are engaging and get people talking and laughing and kind of relaxed and learning. That's favorable. All of that to me is favorable. Those kind of consequences are favorable to me. So the things that I have found that do that, I keep doing them. It's called reinforcement, right? We don't think about it that way, but that's the way it is. All around us every day, including in your life. That example was from my life. Every day around you in your life, you have reinforcement and punishment going on. Things that you find that kind of work that you just keep doing. Things that don't work, you stop doing, right? And so favorable, unfavorable, punishment, reinforcement. So again, reinforcement is a term we use anytime we see that the consequence that follows a behavior strengthens that behavior, making it more likely to occur in the future. That's called reinforcement. Punishment is just the opposite. Punishment is a term we use anytime we look and we see that the consequence that follows a behavior has the result of weakening a behavior, making it less likely to occur in the future. That's called punishment, okay? So I want you to grab onto those two ideas, those two definitions in this class. Look at your lecture notes, look at the PowerPoint presentation, go through and look at any of the handouts I've provided for you, right? And so come back and look at the next little mini lecture video. This video, again, two key ideas from this little video as a way of review. Behavior results in consequences, brick. But also, two, consequences influence behavior. Both of those ideas are true. Both of those are good BC ideas. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how consequences are also both universal and relative here in the next video. So come back to the next video and we'll wrap up this little mini lecture for this module. See you then.